The other category that is growing, again, creatine actually was born and came out of young people, young athletes trying to improve their performance. But there's also the other side. Basically, when we get older, we have age-related muscle loss. So the older we get, we then start losing muscle mass. And while an elderly person usually is not interested in improving a lot of muscle, putting a lot of muscle on, what they would like to do, they would like to maintain their quality of life. And with that, they have to maintain their muscle mass and actually have to maintain their strength. So one application for creatine that actually has a lot of studies lately, and also an approved health claim in Europe, is the use of creatine in elderly people, showing that if you are using creatine as an older person, that you can actually improve muscular function, strength and power, and that again relates directly into quality of life of older people. That is true. There have been several studies on creatine after traumatic brain injury. And the studies actually show that if you're supplementing with creatine, you can actually speed up the recovery of the brain after traumatic brain injury. So if you actually unfortunately go through that, if you have a concussion or you get into an accident, then actually creatine supplementation can help you to recover from brain injury quicker than without creatine. This is a topic that is close to my heart. As I mentioned earlier, when I started my career with SKW, doing research on creatine, actually my task that I was given was to find something that is better than monohydrate. So we came up with a couple of different salts, trying to improve the solubility, potentially improve the absorption into the blood. And we used the creatine citrate and creatine pyruvates of different salts. However, when we did performance studies, while they potentially had small benefits when it comes to like better soluble or better absorption, that doesn't really translate into meaningful benefits later on. You don't see an increase in performance from that. But creatine has been around for a long time. People try to differentiate, they come up with new forms of creatine. And just recently, together with Professor Kreider, we published a review of new forms of creatine. So we went through the scientific literature of every form of creatine that is actually on the market right now. And the review concluded that while there are a lot of different forms of creatine available, not a single of those new formulations actually has shown in clinical studies significantly improved performance over monohydrate. So after all those years, after 20 years, and a lot of attempts in trying to make something better than monohydrate, there's still nothing out there that outperforms creatine monohydrate. During our review, we looked at different forms of creatine, including the buffered creatine, which is marketed as crealkaline. We were only able to identify one published study that actually went through peer review. And the study was actually done in 2012, was published in 2012 already, so more than 10 years ago. And that study actually was a direct comparison of a low dose of buffered creatine, a high dose of buffered creatine, and compared that to a high dose of creatine monohydrate. What the study actually showed, and was done by Professor Kreider's lab, is that the low dose is not as effective as the high dose of creatine monohydrate. So it's not as effective in increasing creatine stores, and also later on it's not as effective in increasing performance. The high dose of the buffered creatine was still not, if you're looking at the absolute values, was not as good as monohydrate, but it works. So the high dose works. So the study did not find any evidence that the low dose of buffered creatine is as effective as a higher dose of monohydrate. I've seen over the years many different creatine forms that claim that you don't need a loading phase with this specific form of creatine. But if you're going back to how creatine works, you have to actually increase the creatine content in your muscle. And only if you can significantly increase that content, then you see performance benefits. So therefore you have to supplement over multiple days if you're using a high dose, or even weeks if you're using a low dose. So both of these methods are loading the muscle with creatine. So therefore, if you read the claim as that there's no loading required, meaning it should work with just giving it one time acutely. And there is no evidence whatsoever that this form of creatine or any other form of creatine actually has an acute effect on muscle health, acutely helping you to build more muscle to improve your strength or power. That is another common misunderstanding of the chemistry of creatine. What we know about creatine instability in liquids actually is that the higher the temperature, the less stable it is. The lower the pH, so the more acidic, the less stable it is. But there comes a point, and it's around a pH of 2.5, where actually it turns around again. So at a very low pH, creatine is perfectly stable again, because the degradation of the creatine molecule actually goes through an intramolecular cyclization. In very acidic conditions, I can no longer have this reaction happening. So at very low pH, creatine is perfectly stable. So therefore, a creatine monohydrate or any other form of creatine, once it's in the stomach, is perfectly stable. It's absolutely fascinating for me to see that actually an established ingredient that has been growing every year for many, many years because of its being highly effective, all of a sudden saw a huge spike in sales. 2 years ago, within a period of 1 year, actually, creatine sales doubled. And again, in the last 12 months, actually, there was another increase of 40% of creatine sales. The main reason for that is a couple different ones actually that we have there. One is the new applications that we have. So we see actually now creatine being used for cognitive benefits. We see creatine being used in an elderly population. So those are two new groups of consumers that are taking creatine. But also in the past, creatine was not popular with women. And recently there has been certain TikTok videos that actually suggested to the female population that creatine is very effective and can be very beneficial. And based on those, actually there was a significant increase in interest in creatine supplementation by women. So those are the factors that actually helped spike creatine sales during the last couple of years. I personally believe that the creatine will always continue to grow. And the main reason for that is because creatine is so effective. When people buy supplements, they look for ingredients that really give them a benefit they can feel, they can see. And if you're taking creatine, you're actually going and then you're lifting weights or you're doing any kind of exercise, you will actually immediately see and feel that you now can actually reach a different level that you were not able to use before. So with the gaining of popularity of creatine and it being so effective, I would expect it to grow for many, many years to come. I always felt that the creatine market in Japan was always a few years behind the US. I think creatine became popular and peaked first in the US. What you actually have in Japan, which I really value, is that you have less of the gimmicks that we see in the US. In the US, there are a lot of companies that, again, make claims of no loading phase or make significant, that their form of creatine is better than monohydrate. You see a lot of, unfortunately, those players that are out on the market. And that's the one thing I always appreciated about Japan, is that Japan is very science-driven. So they actually use the format, the monohydrate, that has been studied the most, that has the safety profile, and that really, as long as there's no significant benefit, validated benefits, not claimed benefit, but actually validated benefits of new forms of creatine, then actually the monohydrate stays the leading format within the Japanese market. So any fan of creatine in Japan, I think you picked the right ingredient. If you're looking at what you should take on a daily basis, if you want to work out, if you're actually an athlete, if you're recreational, the two biggest things you should always take is protein, because you need the protein for recovery, you need the protein to build muscle, but then it's creatine. You want to take an ingredient that gives you additional energy, that allows you to push harder and reach new personal best. So therefore, any fan of creatine is also I'm a fan of, because I'm a big fan of creatine.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.